great. I didn't pay $7,000 to sit next to cargo.
The words sliced through the hushed elegance of Vanguard Airlines' first-class cabin like a blade through silk. They weren't whispered. They weren't muttered under someone's breath. They were delivered with the precision of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument, loud enough for every passenger in the premium section to hear clear enough that there could be no misunderstanding about their intent. Victoria Hamilton stood in the aisle of Flight 847, her Hermès purse clutched like a weapon, her perfectly manicured finger pointing directly at the quiet black man seated in 2A. She wasn't embarrassed. She wasn't apologetic. She was righteous in her indignation, certain in her entitlement, and completely unaware that in exactly 47 minutes she would discover that the man she was trying to remove was the only person on this aircraft capable of keeping her alive. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we dive into this story, I want you to do something for me. Drop your city in the comments below. Let me know where you're watching from, because what you're about to witness isn't just entertainment. It's a masterclass in how assumptions can destroy lives, and how quiet competence can move mountains. If you've ever been judged for how you look, if you've ever been underestimated because of the color of your skin or the simplicity of your clothes, then hit that subscribe button right now, because this story is for you. This is about to become the most expensive tantrum in aviation history. A 47-minute journey from ignorance to humiliation, from privilege to consequences, from assumption to absolute truth. Victoria Hamilton thought she was dealing with a problem passenger. What she was actually doing was picking a fight with the one man who held 300 lives, including her own, in his hands. The man in seat 2A didn't look like much. No designer labels, no flashy jewelry, no obvious signs of wealth or status. Just a quiet professional in a navy polo shirt reading technical manuals and making notes with a red pen. To Victoria Hamilton, he looked like exactly the kind of person who didn't belong in first class. To everyone else on that plane, he was about to become a hero. So, buckle up, because when turbulence hits at 35,000 feet, karma hits even harder. And Victoria Hamilton was about to learn that the most dangerous thing you can do on an airplane isn't forgetting to put your phone in airplane mode or leaving your seatbelt unbuckled during takeoff. The most dangerous thing you can do is assume you know who belongs where based on nothing more than the color of their skin and the simplicity of their clothes. This is the story of how one woman's racist meltdown almost killed 300 people and how one man's quiet competence saved them all. This is the story of Flight 847 and why it became known as the day karma learned to fly. Dr. Cameron Brooks had seen this look before. He was 42 years old, built like a former athlete who'd traded the gym for the library, but hadn't forgotten the discipline either required. His hands were surgeon steady as he turned another page in the Boeing 787 Technical Operations Manual, making precise notes in the margins with a red pen that had seen more emergency procedures than most pilots would encounter in a lifetime. There was a small scar on his left hand barely visible unless you knew to look for it, a reminder of the childhood incident that had first sparked his fascination with how things worked and what happened when they didn't. Cameron wore a simple navy polo shirt khakis that had seen better days, and a functional watch that told time tracked his heart rate and could survive being submerged in water for 30 minutes. No designer labels. No obvious wealth. No signs that he was anything more than a middle management type who'd somehow scraped together enough miles for an upgrade. Which was exactly how he preferred it. He'd learned long ago that being underestimated was often an advantage. The first-class cabin of Vanguard Flight 847 hummed with the quiet efficiency of a machine designed to separate the wealthy from the merely comfortable. Soft amber lighting cast everything in a golden glow. The scent of leather and carefully conditioned air mixed with the subtle fragrance of expensive perfumes and aftershaves. Passengers spoke in hushed tones if they spoke at all, understanding that silence was part of what they'd purchased along with the extra legroom and premium service. Everyone belonged here. Everyone had paid their dues, earned their status, or accumulated enough frequent flyer miles to justify the upgrade. Everyone except apparently the man in 2A. That's where Victoria Hamilton came in. She entered the cabin like weather impossible to ignore and potentially devastating to anyone caught in her path. At 48, Victoria had perfected the art of making her presence known. Her blonde hair was engineered into submission, every strand precisely placed and lacquered into position. Her jewelry collection could have funded a small country's education budget. Diamond earrings that caught the cabin lighting like disco balls, a necklace that probably had its own insurance policy, and wedding rings that announced her status as clearly as a billboard. Her designer dress fit perfectly because it had been tailored perfectly, and her shoes probably cost more than most people made in a month. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who had never heard the word no applied to anything she genuinely wanted. Victoria stopped at row 2 and checked her boarding pass, then checked the seat numbers, then checked her boarding pass again. She was in 2B, the aisle seat directly next to Cameron. She looked at him the way someone might look at a stain on an otherwise perfect tablecloth, with the disgust, confusion, and the immediate certainty that it needed to be removed. Across the aisle, Sofia Martinez was hanging a coat for a passenger in row 3. At 29, Sofia had been flying for 8 years and had seen every kind of passenger emergency meltdown and entitled outburst that commercial aviation had to offer. She had thick black hair pulled back in the regulation-style kind eyes that missed nothing, and the sort of patient professionalism that could de-escalate almost any situation. Almost. She noticed Victoria's reaction immediately and began moving closer, her instincts telling her that whatever was about to happen would require intervention. In seat 4C, Riley Davis was setting up her laptop and checking her livestream equipment. At 26, Riley had built a following of nearly 200,000 people who tuned in to watch her travel adventures, aviation industry insights, and the occasional dramatic passenger encounter. She had no idea she was about to document the most important flight of her career. Captain Jake Morrison was in the cockpit running through his pre-flight checklist with the methodical precision of someone who'd been flying for 15 years but had only been a captain for 8 months. At 35, Jake was young for a captain recently promoted, and still felt the weight of responsibility every time he sat in the left seat. He was good at his job, but he wasn't great at conflict, and he was about to be tested in ways he'd never imagined. The aircraft itself was a Boeing 787 Dreamliner, one of the most advanced commercial jets in the sky. It was equipped with state-of-the-art avionics, redundant safety systems, and enough technology to practically fly itself. Under normal circumstances, it was one of the safest ways to travel ever invented. But circumstances were about to become anything but normal. Outside storm clouds gathered over Miami International Airport. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, with wind gusts approaching the limits for safe takeoff. Air traffic control was spacing departures further apart, and delays were mounting. Flight 847 was running 20 minutes behind schedule, and everyone from the gate agents to the flight crew was feeling the pressure to get airborne before the weather got worse. It was the perfect storm, literally and figuratively, for what was about to unfold. Victoria Hamilton looked at Cameron Brooks one more time, confirming her initial assessment. He didn't belong here. Everything about him was wrong. His clothes, his demeanor, his complete lack of deference to the social hierarchy she understood governed spaces like this. In her world, first class was reserved for people like her, successful, wealthy, important. Not for people like him. She was about to make that point crystal clear. Cameron, meanwhile, continued reading. He was reviewing emergency hydraulic procedures, cross-referencing manufacturer specifications with real-world performance data, and making notes about a recurring issue with cold weather valve response that had been flagging in incident reports. It was a complex technical work that required absolute focus and deep expertise. It was also work that would prove critical in ways none of them could have imagined. The stage was set. The players were in position. And somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the Florida sky like a warning no one was listening to. Victoria Hamilton was about to discover that assumptions could be deadly. Cameron Brooks was about to prove that quiet competence could save lives, and 300 passengers were about to witness the most dramatic reversal of fortune in commercial aviation history. The plane hadn't even left the ground yet. Victoria Hamilton didn't sit down. She didn't put her Hermes Birkin bag in the overhead compartment. She didn't acknowledge the flight attendant's welcoming smile or settle into her seat like every other passenger boarding Flight 847. Instead, she spun on her designer heels and snapped her fingers at Sofia Martinez with the sharp crack of someone accustomed to instant obedience. "Excuse me," Victoria announced, her voice carrying the sort of authority usually reserved for courtrooms or corporate boardrooms. "There's been a mistake." Sophia approached with the practiced smile of someone who'd diffused 1,000 passenger complaints, her internal radar already pinging with warnings. "Good evening, Mrs. Hamilton. How can I help you tonight? I am in seat 2B, Victoria said, brandishing her boarding pass like evidence in a criminal trial. "I specifically requested a seat with privacy. I paid $7,000 for this ticket, and I did not pay that much money to sit next to—" She gestured vaguely at Cameron, who was still absorbed in his technical manual red pen, poised over a diagram of hydraulic pressure valves. That. Cameron didn't look up. He simply turned a page, his concentration unbroken by the drama unfolding 18 inches away. His pen moved across the page in precise, deliberate strokes, marking sections with the methodical attention of someone who understood that details could mean the difference between life and death. Sophia glanced at Cameron, then back at Victoria. "I understand your concern, Mrs. Hamilton, but the cabin is completely full tonight. The gentleman in 2A has a valid ticket, and the seat configuration does offer quite a bit of privacy with the—" "I don't care about the configuration," Victoria hissed, leaning closer to Sophia. Her voice dropped to what she probably thought was a whisper, but was loud enough for half the first-class cabin to hear. "Look at him. He's scribbling notes on some kind of manual. He looks suspicious. I don't feel safe." That got Cameron's attention. He looked up slowly, his dark eyes taking in Victoria's face, then shifting to Sophia, then returning to Victoria. There was something in his gaze, not anger, not indignation, but a sort of careful assessment like a doctor evaluating symptoms. "Ma'am," Cameron said, his voice deep and controlled, "is there something specific about my reading material that concerns you?" Victoria's face flushed. "Don't you ma'am me. I know exactly what you're doing. You're studying diagrams of this airplane. That's not normal passenger behavior. That's suspicious behavior. Suspicious how Cameron asked. Like you're planning something." The words hung in the cabin air like smoke from an electrical fire, acrid, dangerous, and impossible to ignore. Conversations stopped. Newspapers lowered. The gentle hum of normal pre-flight activity gave way to the sort of charged silence that precedes lightning strikes. In seat 4, C. Riley Davis quietly activated her live stream. "Hey everyone," she whispered into her phone camera. "I'm on a flight to Seattle and something is happening right now that you need to see." She adjusted the angle to capture the confrontation in row 2. "This is going out live. I want him moved," Victoria continued, her voice rising. "Put him back in economy where he clearly belongs and leave this row empty for me. I have medical issues, I need space, I need privacy, and I need to feel safe." Sophia's professional smile was beginning to strain. "Mrs. Hamilton." "I understand your concerns, but no," Victoria cut her off. "You don't understand. I am a Diamond Medallion member. I am married to Federal Judge Richard Hamilton. Do you know what that means?" "It means you're married to a federal judge," Cameron said quietly. Victoria whirled on him. "It means I know people. Important people. People who can make problems for this airline if they don't take passenger safety seriously." "Safety," Cameron repeated, his tone thoughtful. "That's interesting. What's that supposed to mean?" "It's an interesting choice of words, considering you're demanding the removal of a passenger who hasn't threatened anyone, hasn't violated any regulations, and whose only crime appears to be reading while black." The words landed like a physical blow. Victoria's mouth opened and closed twice before any sound came out. "How dare you," she finally managed. "How dare you make this about race? This has nothing to do with race. This has to do with suspicious behavior and inappropriate materials, and Ma'am Cameron interrupted gently. What exactly do you think I'm reading? Victoria gestured at the manual in his hands. Some kind of airplane schematic. Technical documents. The kind of things passengers shouldn't have access to. Cameron held up the manual so she could see the cover clearly. Boeing, 787 Technical Operations Manual Revision 12. Standard reference material for anyone working in commercial aviation. Exactly my point. Passengers don't work in commercial aviation. That's an interesting assumption, Cameron said. He closed the manual and set it carefully on his tray table. Please continue. But Victoria was just getting started. She pulled out her phone and opened the camera app. I'm documenting this, she announced. I'm recording everything. When this plane crashes because you let a terrorist study technical manuals in first class, my husband will sue this airline into bankruptcy. Riley's live stream viewer count jumped from 50 to 500. Comments began flowing in real time. Is this really happening? She just called him a terrorist for reading. This is insane. Vanguard shame. Sophia tried one more time. Mrs. Hamilton, please lower your voice. Other passengers. Other passengers need to know they're in danger. Victoria snapped. They need to know this airline is more concerned with political correctness than passenger safety. She held her phone up the camera lens pointed directly at Cameron's face. Smile for the camera, she sneered. Everyone's going to see what real passenger intimidation looks like. Cameron looked directly into the lens. His expression was calm, almost serene. When he spoke, his voice carried the sort of quiet authority that made people listen without being asked. Ma'am, he said you're violating federal aviation regulations by filming passengers without consent, interfering with flight crew duties, and creating a disturbance that could delay this aircraft's departure. I suggest you put the phone away. I'll show you a disturbance, Victoria screamed. That's when Captain Jake Morrison stepped out of the cockpit. Jake was 35 years old, recently promoted to captain and absolutely terrified of anything that might jeopardize his spotless flight record. He emerged from the flight deck adjusting his captain's hat, his face already showing the strain of someone who could feel his evening spiraling out of control. What's going on here? He asked, his voice carrying the sort of forced authority of someone trying very hard to sound like he knew what he was doing. Victoria saw the 4 stripes on his shoulder and immediately shifted her focus like a heat-seeking missile acquiring a target. Captain, she said, her voice suddenly sweet and reasonable, thank God you're here. I've been trying to explain to your crew that there's a security issue in first class. Jake looked at Cameron, who was sitting quietly with his hands folded. He looked at Sophia, whose professional mask was cracking around the edges. He looked at the growing number of passengers who had pulled out phones and were recording everything. He was a good pilot, but he was not prepared for this. What kind of security issue? Jake asked. Victoria smiled. She could sense weakness in authority, figures the way sharks sense blood in water. This passenger, she said, pointing at Cameron, has been studying technical diagrams of your aircraft. He's been making notes, marking sections, studying emergency procedures. When I expressed concern for passenger safety, he became aggressive and confrontational. Jake looked at Cameron again. Cameron looked back steadily, saying nothing. Sir Jake said, "Is there anything you'd like to say about this?" Cameron's response was delivered in the sort of calm, measured tone that suggested depths Victoria Hamilton had not yet begun to fathom. "Captain," he said, "that's an interesting question. What exactly would you like me to say?" Captain Jake Morrison felt the weight of 300 lives pressing down on his shoulders, along with the growing awareness that whatever decision he made in the next few minutes would define not just this flight, but possibly his entire career. The storm outside was getting worse. Air traffic control was already backing up departures. Every minute they sat at the gate was another minute closer to a weather delay that could cascade into a nightmare of missed connections, angry passengers, and corporate scrutiny. Jake needed this problem to disappear. Fast. "Sir," he said to Cameron, trying to project the sort of calm authority he'd seen in senior captains, but didn't quite feel himself. "Maybe you could help me understand why you have technical manuals for this aircraft." Victoria Hamilton smiled like a cat that had just cornered a mouse. This was going exactly as she'd hoped. Authority was finally taking her concerns seriously. Cameron looked at Jake for a long moment, then at Victoria, then back at Jake. When he spoke, his voice carried the sort of patience usually reserved for teaching children basic concepts. "Captain, are you asking me to justify my reading material? I'm asking you to help me understand whether I have the right to read technical literature as a paying passenger on a commercial aircraft." Jake felt sweat beading on his forehead. This was not going according to script. In every scenario he'd trained for, passengers either complied with crew requests or became obviously belligerent. Cameron Brooks was doing neither. Victoria sensed Jake's hesitation and pressed her advantage. "Captain, I'm not just talking about suspicious reading material, I'm talking about his entire demeanor. He's been watching the cabin, studying passenger movements, taking notes on crew procedures. This is textbook pre-attack behavior." Riley Davis's live stream had exploded to over 2,000 viewers. The comments were coming so fast she could barely read them. "This woman is insane. She really just said pre-attack behavior for reading, recording for evidence, Vanguard discrimination. This is going viral in 3, 2, 1. Sophia Martinez had retreated to the galley and was quietly photographing the incident with her own phone while speaking in hushed tones to someone on the aircraft phone. "We have a code red passenger discrimination incident in first class. Yes, I'm documenting everything. No, the target passenger has been completely compliant." Victoria was just getting warmed up. She pulled out her phone again, this time switching to video mode. "I'm going to document this entire interaction for my husband's law firm. When this airline gets sued for endangering passenger safety by refusing to remove an obvious security threat, my recording will be Exhibit A." She held the phone up, making sure to capture Cameron's face clearly. "State your name for the record," she demanded. Cameron looked directly into the camera. "Ma'am, you're filming passengers without consent for the second time. That's a federal crime. I'm documenting suspicious behavior. You're creating suspicious behavior." Victoria's face flushed red. "How dare you turn this around on me? I am not the one with terrorist materials. I am not the one making other passengers uncomfortable." Actually, came a voice from seat 3. You're the only one making anyone uncomfortable." Everyone turned to see an elderly man in an expensive suit lowering his newspaper. "I'm Dr. Robert Martinez, retired airline safety inspector. 23 years with the FAA. And lady, you're the only security threat I see in this cabin." Victoria whirled on him. How is reading airplane technical manuals not a security threat? Dr. Martinez folded his newspaper carefully, because understanding aircraft systems is literally the opposite of a security threat. It's a security asset. The only people who study those manuals are people who want planes to work properly. That's exactly what they want you to think, Victoria shot back. Riley's viewer count hit 5,000. The hashtag Vanguard shame was starting to trend on Twitter. News outlets were beginning to pick up the story from social media feeds. Cameron closed his manual and placed it carefully on his tray table. "Mrs. Hamilton," he said quietly, "I'm going to give you one chance to de-escalate this situation." De-escalate. Victoria laughed a high brittle sound. "I'm not escalating anything. I'm trying to prevent a tragedy. I'm trying to save lives. Whose lives are you saving, everyone on this plane? From you," Cameron nodded thoughtfully. "And what exactly am I going to do to 300 passengers while strapped into a monitored seat in first class?" Victoria waved the technical manual. "Study their vulnerabilities. Plan your attack. Wait for the right moment. The right moment for what to hijack this plane." The words dropped into the cabin like a bomb. Conversations didn't just stop, they evaporated. The only sound was the whistle of wind against the aircraft's hull and the distant rumble of thunder. Captain Jake Morrison felt the last of his confidence drain away. The word hijack on a commercial aircraft wasn't just inflammatory, it was radioactive. Once spoken, it couldn't be unspoken. Protocols would have to be followed. Reports would have to be filed. Investigations would have to be launched. Even if Victoria was completely wrong, the mere accusation would trigger a cascade of federal attention that could destroy careers, reputations, and lives. Mrs. Hamilton. Jake said carefully, "That's a very serious accusation." "It's a very serious situation," Victoria replied. "And you, Captain, need to decide whether you're going to prioritize political correctness or passenger safety." Cameron Brooks sat perfectly still. His hands remained folded, his breathing remained steady, his expression remained calm. But something had changed in his eyes, a sort of crystalline hardening, like water turning to ice. "Captain Morrison," he said, and somehow Jake knew without being told that Cameron knew his name. "You have a choice to make. I'm trying to handle this professionally. You're trying to appease a passenger who just accused me of planning to hijack your aircraft based on my choice of reading material and the color of my skin." Victoria exploded. "I never mentioned race." Cameron looked at her with the sort of patient attention a teacher might give to a student who just claimed that 2 + 2 = fish. "Mrs. Hamilton, you've accused me of being a terrorist, a hijacker, and a security threat. You've demanded my removal from first class. You've suggested I don't belong in this cabin, and your evidence consists of the fact that I'm reading technical manuals while being black in a space you feel should be exclusively yours. That's not, I never, this has nothing to do with." Then what does it have to do with Victoria's mouth opened and closed several times? Around her, passengers were recording everything. Flight attendants were documenting everything. The corporate crisis management team was monitoring everything, and somewhere in the cockpit, warning lights were beginning to flash on the hydraulic system panel, indicating the sort of technical emergency that would require exactly the kind of expertise Victoria Hamilton was demanding be removed from the aircraft. But none of them knew that yet. And Captain Morrison Cameron said, his voice carrying a note of finality, "You have about 30 seconds to decide whether you're going to handle this professionally or whether you're going to let a passenger run your aircraft." Jake Morrison looked at Cameron Brooks. He looked at Victoria Hamilton. He looked at the growing crowd of passengers with cameras. And he made the worst decision of his professional life. "Sir," he said to Cameron, "I think it might be best if you moved to a different seat." Cameron Brooks had been expecting this moment for most of his adult life. Not this exact scenario. He'd never imagined being asked to move seats because a racist passenger thought his technical expertise looked suspicious. But he'd been expecting the moment when his competence would be questioned, his presence would be challenged, and his right to occupy space in America would be reduced to the whims of someone who looked like Victoria Hamilton. He'd been preparing for this moment since he was 12 years old, and a bus driver in Detroit told him and his father that they looked like trouble and needed to find another way home. He'd been preparing for it through 4 years at the Air Force Academy, where classmates questioned whether he'd earned his spot or just filled a quota. He'd been preparing for it through a decade of aviation engineering, where every mistake was magnified and every success was minimized. Cameron Brooks had spent 30 years becoming too qualified to be dismissed, but Captain Jake Morrison had just dismissed him anyway. "Excuse me, Captain Cameron," said his voice carrying a note that made everyone in first class stop what they were doing and pay attention. "Could you repeat that?" Jake Morrison felt sweat gathering under his collar. The way Cameron had said "captain" didn't sound like deference. It sounded like a judge asking a defendant to clarify a confession. "I think," Jake said, trying to maintain authority, he no longer felt it might be best for everyone if he moved to a different seat. "Just to keep the peace." "To keep the peace," Cameron repeated. "Yes, sir. Whose peace?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Jake looked around the cabin. Every passenger was watching. Every phone was recording. Every decision he made from this point forward would be scrutinized, analyzed, and judged by people far more important than anyone on this aircraft. Victoria Hamilton sensed victory. Finally, she breathed. Some common sense. Cameron turned to look at her, really look at her. For the first time since this whole encounter began, he focused his complete attention on Victoria Hamilton, studying her like a problem to be solved. "Mrs. Hamilton," he said quietly, You've just convinced an airline captain to remove a passenger based on your personal comfort level. How does that feel? Victoria straightened. It feels like safety and common sense. Interesting, Cameron said. He reached into his carry-on bag and pulled out his phone. Do you mind if I make a call? I mind if you do anything except leave this cabin, Victoria snapped. Cameron wasn't talking to Victoria anymore. He was talking to Captain Morrison. Captain, do I have your permission to make one phone call before I comply with your request to change seats? Jake nodded, grateful for anything that might delay this nightmare a few more minutes. Cameron dialed a number from memory. The phone rang twice before a crisp professional voice answered. Vanguard Airlines Corporate Emergency Response. This is Marcus Thompson. Cameron put the phone on speaker. Marcus, this is Cameron Brooks. I'm on Flight 847, currently at the gate in Miami. We have a situation. Cameron Marcus's voice brightened immediately. Are you already reviewing the hydraulic modifications for the London route? I thought your flight didn't leave for another hour. The flight has been delayed. I've been asked to change seats due to a passenger complaint. A passenger complaint? Marcus's tone shifted to confused concern. What kind of passenger complaint? Cameron looked directly at Captain Morrison. A passenger has accused me of being a security threat because I was reading technical manuals. The captain has decided to accommodate her request by moving me to a different seat. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for exactly 5 seconds. When Marcus spoke again, his voice carried the sort of controlled fury that comes with 20 years of corporate crisis management. Captain Morrison, are you on this call? Jake's voice came out as a croak. Yes, sir. Captain Morrison, did you just agree to move Dr. Cameron Brooks to accommodate a passenger complaint about his reading material? I was trying to de-escalate Captain Morrison. Do you know who Dr. Cameron Brooks is? Jake looked at Cameron. Cameron looked back steadily, saying nothing. He's a passenger who was making another passenger uncomfortable, Jake said. Riley Davis's live stream exploded past 10,000 viewers. Comments poured in faster than her phone could display them. Oh snap, he's about to get exposed. This captain is about to learn something. Plot, twist, incoming Vanguard. Fail. Marcus Thompson's voice came through the speaker with crystalline clarity. Captain Morrison, Dr. Cameron Brooks is Vanguard Airlines Chief Flight Training Officer. He is the man responsible for training every single pilot in our fleet on emergency procedures. He wrote the manual you used to qualify for your captain's certification. He is currently traveling to London to investigate a hydraulic system anomaly that has been affecting 787 operations in cold weather conditions. The cabin went dead silent. Victoria Hamilton's face began to drain of color. Captain Jake Morrison felt the world tilt sideways. Furthermore, Marcus continued, Dr. Brooks is traveling on company business at company expense reviewing company technical documentation that he literally helped write. The passenger complaint you're accommodating is essentially asking you to remove our chief flight training officer for doing his job. Victoria found her voice. That's impossible. Chief training officers don't fly coach. Mrs. Hamilton Marcus's voice came through the speaker with laser precision. Dr. Brooks doesn't fly coach, he flies first class. Company policy. Which you would know if you hadn't spent the last 20 minutes demanding that we remove one of our most senior technical experts for the crime of being black while qualified. The words hit the cabin like a physical force. Passengers gasped. Phones swiveled to capture Victoria's reaction. Sophia Martinez stepped closer, her professional demeanor now clearly protective of Cameron rather than conciliatory toward Victoria. Victoria's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. I never, this has nothing to do with race. I was concerned about passenger safety, Mrs. Hamilton, Cameron said quietly. You were concerned about passenger comfort. Specifically your comfort with sharing space with someone who doesn't look like you. That's not true. Cameron stood up slowly. He was tall, imposing without being threatening, carrying himself with the sort of quiet authority that comes from knowing exactly who you are and what you're capable of. Mrs. Hamilton, you've just spent 20 minutes trying to convince an airline captain to remove the person most qualified to ensure this aircraft operates safely. You did this based on nothing more than your assumption that someone who looks like me couldn't possibly belong in first class." He looked at Captain Morrison. "Captain, you just agreed to remove your chief flight training officer to appease a passenger who thinks competence looks suspicious when it comes in black skin." Jake Morrison felt like he was drowning. "Dr. Brooks, I didn't know, Captain Morrison," Cameron said, and his voice carried the weight of authority that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with competence you didn't know because you didn't ask. You made a decision about who belonged where based on appearance and assumption rather than facts and qualifications. He looked around the cabin at the sea of phones still recording everything. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, addressing the passengers directly, "what you've just witnessed is a masterclass in how bias works. Not the cartoon racism of burning crosses and white hoods, but the everyday assumption that competence has a color, that qualification has a look, and that someone's right to occupy space should be subject to the comfort level of people who think they own that space." Cameron sat back down and reopened his technical manual. "Captain Morrison, I'll be staying in seat 2A. Mrs. Hamilton, you have a choice to make. You can sit in your assigned seat next to a qualified aviation professional, or you can request a different flight. But you will not be removing me from first class for doing my job while black." Victoria Hamilton looked around the cabin. Every eye was on her. Every phone was recording her, and for the first time in her entitled life she had absolutely no idea what to do next. The storm outside chose that moment to announce its presence with a flash of lightning that illuminated the cabin windows and a crack of thunder that made everyone jump. And in the cockpit, warning lights began to flash. The hydraulic system warning light in the cockpit started as a gentle amber glow, the kind of minor alert that experienced pilots handle routinely. But within minutes, as Captain Jake Morrison sat frozen in first class trying to process the fact that he'd just attempted to remove his own airline's chief flight training officer, that gentle amber glow turned urgent red. In the cabin, Victoria Hamilton was experiencing her own crisis of authority. The confident superiority that had carried her through 48 years of getting her way had crumbled the moment Marcus Thompson's voice came through that speakerphone. She looked around the first-class cabin and realized that every single passenger was staring at her with a mixture of disgust and disbelief. "This is not over," she announced to no one in particular, her voice cracking slightly. "There are still protocols to follow, security procedures to implement." She pulled out her phone and began dialing frantically. "I'm calling the Federal Aviation Authority. They need to know that this airline is compromising safety for political correctness." Cameron Brooks continued reading his manual, making notes with methodical precision. But now his red pen was moving faster, marking sections with increasing urgency as he cross-referenced cold weather hydraulic performance data with the storm system currently battering Miami International Airport. Sophia Martinez approached Victoria with the sort of careful diplomacy usually reserved for hostage negotiations. "Mrs. Hamilton, perhaps we could discuss alternative seating arrangements that might make you more comfortable." "Alternative arrangements." Victoria's voice rose to a pitch that made several passengers wince. "I don't want alternative arrangements. I want that man investigated. I want his credentials verified. I want to speak to federal air marshals." As if summoned by her words, a broad-shouldered man in a simple dark suit appeared at the entrance to first class. Federal Air Marshal Roberto Rodriguez had been seated in 12C, monitoring the situation through the crew communication system, waiting to see if intervention would be necessary. Now it was necessary. Rodriguez approached with the sort of calm authority that comes from 15 years of dealing with aerial disturbances, terrorist threats, and entitled passengers who thought their ticket price bought them the right to endanger other travelers. "Ma'am," he said to Victoria, "I'm Air Marshal Rodriguez. I understand you've been expressing concerns about passenger safety." Victoria's face lit up with vindication. Finally, real authority. Federal authority, the kind of authority that understood serious threats when they saw them. "Yes," she said, gesturing dramatically toward Cameron. "That passenger has been studying technical diagrams of this aircraft, making notes about emergency procedures, and when I expressed legitimate safety concerns, he became aggressive and confrontational." Marshal Rodriguez looked at Cameron, who was still absorbed in his manual. "Sir, could you look up for a moment?" Cameron raised his eyes. The two men looked at each other for exactly 3 seconds. Rodriguez nodded almost imperceptibly. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, turning back to Victoria, "I've been monitoring this situation for the past 15 minutes. The only aggressive and confrontational behavior I've observed has come from you." Victoria's mouth fell open. "That's impossible. I'm the victim here. I'm being threatened by a suspicious passenger with terrorist materials. Ma'am, those aren't terrorist materials. That's a standard Boeing technical manual, the kind used by airline employees, safety inspectors, and aviation professionals." Rodriguez's voice carried the patience of someone accustomed to explaining obvious things to people who didn't want to understand them. "How do you know he's an aviation professional?" Victoria demanded. "Because I know who he is." The simple statement dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water, creating ripples that spread through the first-class cabin and beyond. Riley Davis's live stream viewer count had climbed past 20,000. The hashtag Vanguard discrimination was trending on multiple platforms. News outlets were beginning to reach out to Vanguard's corporate communications team. And in the Vanguard Airlines Crisis Management Center 3 time zones away, Marcus Thompson was fielding increasingly panicked calls from executives who were watching their company's reputation implode in real time. Sir Jake Morrison said to Rodriguez, desperation creeping into his voice, "I need to understand the situation clearly. Are we dealing with a security threat or not?" Rodriguez looked at Jake with the sort of expression usually reserved for students who'd failed basic comprehension tests. "Captain, the security threat in this cabin is not the gentleman reading technical manuals. The security threat is the passenger who's been filming other travelers without consent, making false accusations, and attempting to incite panic based on racial profiling." Victoria exploded. "Racial profiling? How is this about race? This is about suspicious behavior and inappropriate materials." And Ma'am Rodriguez interrupted. "You accused a black aviation professional of being a terrorist because he was reading job-related technical documentation. If that's not racial profiling, what would you call it?" "I would call it common-sense safety protocols." "No, ma'am, you would call it a federal crime." The words hit Victoria like a physical blow. Federal crime, knowingly filing false reports of terrorist activity. Interference with flight crew operations. Harassment of passengers based on protected characteristics. Any one of these could result in federal charges. All 3 together could result in significant jail time. Cameron finally looked up from his manual. "Marshal Rodriguez, while I appreciate your support, Mrs. Hamilton is actually correct about one thing." Everyone turned to look at him. "There's a potential safety issue on this aircraft." Victoria's face lit up with vindication. "I knew it," Cameron continued in the same calm tone. "The potential safety issue is that we have a captain who is willing to remove qualified personnel based on passenger complaints, and we have a hydraulic system that's showing stress indicators consistent with the cold weather performance anomalies I came here to investigate." Jake Morrison's blood went cold. Hydraulic stress indicators. "Captain, when was the last time you reviewed the emergency procedures for hydraulic system failure in adverse weather conditions?" Jake's face went pale. We covered that in annual training." "Which procedures did you cover? The standard checklist approach?" Cameron nodded thoughtfully. "And if the standard checklist doesn't work, if the hydraulic valves freeze in position and the backup systems fail to engage?" Jake stared at him. I would radio for guidance." "From whom?" From company technical support, Captain Morrison. I am company technical support, and you just spent 20 minutes trying to have me removed from this aircraft." The implications of what Jake had nearly done began to sink in like water through a failing dam. If there was a hydraulic emergency, and based on the stress indicators Cameron was referencing there very well, might be he had almost removed the one person most qualified to handle it. Because Victoria Hamilton was uncomfortable sitting next to a black man. Marshal Rodriguez stepped closer to Victoria. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to sit down, put your phone away, and remain quiet for the duration of this flight. Any further disruption will result in your immediate arrest upon landing. You can't arrest me for expressing safety concerns. Ma'am, I'm not arresting you for expressing safety concerns. I'm threatening to arrest you for filing false reports, harassing passengers, and interfering with flight operations. The choice is yours." Victoria looked around the cabin one last time. Every passenger was still watching. Every phone was still recording. And for the first time in her privileged life, she realized she had no power here. She sat down hard in seat 2B, her face red with humiliation and rage. Cameron returned his attention to his manual, but now he was flipping pages more quickly, cross-referencing data with increasing urgency. "Captain Morrison," he said quietly, "you might want to check your hydraulic system indicators." Jake hurried toward the cockpit, his movements jerky with barely controlled panic. And in the passenger cabin, Riley Davis whispered into her live-stream camera, "I think we're about to find out why they call him the Chief Flight Training Officer." The storm outside intensified, and the first drops of rain began to streak across the aircraft windows. Captain Jake Morrison reached the cockpit to find his first officer, David Rodriguez, pointing at the central display with barely controlled concern. "Jake, we've got amber warnings on the primary hydraulic system. Pressure's fluctuating and the temperature readings are all over the place." Jake dropped into the left seat and scanned the instruments. The hydraulic system that controlled everything from landing gear to flight controls was showing signs of stress that fell somewhere between concerning and potentially catastrophic. "When did this start?" Jake asked. "About 5 minutes ago. Right around the time the temperature dropped and the wind picked up." In the cabin, Cameron Brooks was reviewing hydraulic schematics with the focused intensity of a surgeon preparing for emergency surgery. His red pen moved across the pages in swift, precise strokes, marking valve positions, pressure points, and backup system interfaces. Sophia Martinez approached his seat. "Dr. Brooks, Captain Morrison asked me to give you this." She handed him a note written on Vanguard airline stationery. Cameron read it quickly. "Dr. Brooks' hydraulic system showing anomalies. Primary pressure fluctuating. Could use your input if you're willing." Captain Morrison Cameron looked up at Sophia. "How long has this been developing?" The captain said about 5 minutes. Cameron checked his watch and compared it against the maintenance log in his technical manual. Perfect timing. The system's been showing stress indicators during rapid temperature drops, especially when combined with wind shear conditions. He looked out the window at the storm. "Like now." "Is it dangerous?" Cameron's expression was unreadable. "That depends on how well trained the flight crew is in non-standard emergency procedures." Sophia's face went pale. "Dr. Brooks, Captain Morrison is a good pilot, but he's young, recently promoted, and has never handled a complex hydraulic failure in adverse weather conditions," Cameron finished. "I know. I reviewed his training records before this flight. You reviewed his training records, Sophia. I review everyone's training records. That's my job." Cameron closed his manual and stood up. "And right now, Captain Morrison needs help from the person he just tried to remove from this aircraft because a racist passenger made him uncomfortable." Cameron walked toward the cockpit, passing Victoria Hamilton's seat. She was hunched down, trying to make herself invisible, but she looked up as he passed. "This is all your fault," she hissed. "If something happens to this plane, it's because you created this disruption." Cameron stopped and looked down at her. "Mrs. Hamilton, if something happens to this plane, it will be because Captain Morrison was more concerned with your comfort than with crew competence. But don't worry, I'm not going to let 300 people pay the price for your prejudice." He continued towards the cockpit where Jake Morrison was struggling with hydraulic readings that made increasingly less sense with each passing minute. Cameron knocked on the cockpit door. Captain Morrison, Dr. Brooks, reporting for duty. Jake opened the door immediately. "Dr. Brooks, thank God. We've got a problem." "I know. May I—" Cameron gestured toward the flight engineer's position. "Please." Cameron settled into the jump seat and began reviewing the instrument displays. His hands moved across the controls with the unconscious competence of someone who understood these systems at a cellular level. Primary hydraulic pressure is fluctuating between normal and critical, he observed. Secondary system is compensating, but it's working harder than it should. Backup system is reading normal, but... He paused, studying a particular gauge. Captain, when was the last time the backup hydraulic reservoir was serviced? David Rodriguez checked the maintenance log. 2 weeks ago in Denver. Temperature, when serviced, 85 degrees. Cameron nodded grimly. And current temperature, 42 degrees and dropping. There's your problem. The backup reservoir was serviced with hydraulic fluid calibrated for warm weather operations. Cold weather changes the viscosity, which affects pressure regulation, which affects valve response time. Jake stared at him. Is that why we're getting these readings partly? The primary issue is that the hydraulic valves are beginning to stick in the cold. The secondary issue is that your backup system may not respond properly if you need it. Cameron's fingers moved across the diagnostic controls. The tertiary issue is that if both primary and secondary systems fail, you'll need to execute a manual hydraulic emergency procedure that's not in your standard checklist. What manual emergency procedure? Cameron looked at him with the sort of expression that suggested depths of knowledge Jake hadn't even begun to plumb. The one I developed after the incident in Frankfurt last year. The one that's been integrated into advanced training protocols but hasn't yet been added to standard emergency checklists. I don't know that procedure, I know. That's why I'm here. In the cabin, Riley Davis was providing real-time commentary to her 25,000 live-stream viewers. Okay, everyone. So it turns out the man that racist lady wanted removed is actually the airline's chief flight training officer. And now there's some kind of emergency happening with the plane's systems. I can see him in the cockpit right now, and let me tell you, the pilots look like they're listening to him like he's the voice of God. Comments flooded in. Is the plane in danger? This is like a movie. That racist lady almost got everyone killed. Victoria Hamilton is trending. Now, Sophia Martinez was moving through the cabin with professional calm, but passengers who knew how to read flight attendant body language could see the tension in her shoulders and the way she kept glancing toward the cockpit. Marshal Rodriguez had taken a seat where he could monitor both the first-class situation and the growing awareness among passengers that something unusual was happening. Victoria Hamilton was experiencing what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, the uncomfortable mental state that occurs when your beliefs are contradicted by reality. For 48 years, her worldview had been validated by a society that told her she was important, her opinions mattered, and her comfort was paramount. Now, she was discovering that the man she'd tried to have removed was the only person on this aircraft qualified to keep her alive. In the cockpit, Cameron was walking Jake and David through diagnostic procedures that weren't in any manual they'd ever seen. Primary hydraulic system failure in cold weather typically follows this pattern. Cameron explained, his voice calm and instructional despite the circumstances. First, you get pressure fluctuations as the valves begin to stick. Then, you get temperature warnings as the system works harder to maintain pressure. Finally, you get catastrophic failure when the valves lock completely and the pumps burn out trying to force fluid through blocked lines. How long do we have? Jake asked. Cameron studied the readings. At current deterioration rate and external temperature, maybe 20 minutes before primary system failure. 40 minutes before secondary system failure. After that, he shrugged. We'll be flying a very large glider with some very limited control authority. Jake's face was pale. Can we land before primary system failure? Not in this weather. The storm has closed the airport to departures and arrivals for the next hour minimum. So we wait, Captain Morrison. We don't wait. We prepare. Cameron's voice carried an authority that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with knowledge. I'm going to teach you and First Officer Rodriguez the manual hydraulic emergency procedure. You're going to learn it, practice it, and execute it perfectly. What if we can't learn it in time? Cameron looked at him steadily. Captain, failure is not an option. We have 300 people on this aircraft, including the racist who tried to have me removed. I'm not going to let any of them die because someone thought my skin color was more important than my expertise. Jake nodded. What do you need me to do? First, you need to understand exactly what Mrs. Hamilton almost cost you. If she'd succeeded in having me removed and this hydraulic failure had occurred at altitude, you would have had no choice but to declare an emergency and attempt an uncontrolled landing with whatever systems remained functional. And now you have the person who designed the emergency procedure sitting right here, ready to guide you through it step by step. David Rodriguez looked up from his instruments. Dr. Brooks, the primary system just dropped another 5 psi. Cameron glanced at the readings. Right on schedule. Captain Morrison, it's time for your advanced training to begin. Here, now, with 300 lives hanging in the balance. Cameron's voice was steady, authoritative, and completely unshaken by the enormity of what they were facing. Captain, this is why they call it the Chief Flight Training Officer position. This is where we find out if you're ready to be the pilot these passengers need you to be. Jake Morrison looked at Cameron. Brooks really looked at him for the first time, not as a passenger who didn't belong, not as a problem to be solved, but as the most qualified person in the sky to help him save 300 lives. Dr. Brooks Jake said, "Teach me everything I need to know." Outside, the storm intensified and the hydraulic pressure dropped another 3 psi. Time was running out. As Cameron Brooks began explaining the intricacies of manual hydraulic override procedures to Captain Morrison, his mind flashed back to another cold day 30 years earlier when a 12-year-old boy learned that competence wasn't always enough to earn respect. Detroit, 1993. Cameron and his father Samuel Brooks had been riding the number 16 bus home from Cameron's Saturday morning science club at the community center. Samuel worked 2 jobs: maintenance supervisor at an auto plant during the week, part-time instructor at a community college on weekends. And Cameron was already showing signs of the analytical mind that would eventually make him one of the most respected aviation safety experts in the country. They'd been sitting quietly, Cameron reading a library book about airplane engines, while Samuel reviewed lesson plans for his Monday evening electronics class, when the bus driver suddenly pulled over and turned around. "You two need to find another ride," the driver announced. He was a thick-set white man with graying hair and the kind of certainty that comes from never having his authority questioned. "I got complaints you're making other passengers nervous." Cameron looked up from his book confused. They hadn't been talking loudly. They hadn't been bothering anyone. His father had been grading papers, and Cameron had been absorbed in learning about jet engine combustion chambers. "Excuse me," Samuel said, his voice careful and controlled. "What complaints?" The driver gestured vaguely toward the back of the bus. "Passenger back there says you've been watching people studying them. Says the kid's got some kind of manual he's been making notes in." Cameron held up his library book. "It's about airplane engines. I don't care what it's about. Looks suspicious. You need to get off my bus." Samuel Brooks looked around at the other passengers. Most avoided eye contact. A few nodded in agreement with the driver. One elderly white woman clutched her purse closer and whispered something to her companion about troublemakers. Cameron would never forget what happened next. His father stood up slowly, maintaining dignity in the face of injustice. "Sir, we paid our fare. We're not bothering anyone. My son is reading an educational book from the public library. I don't care if he's reading the Bible. I got a right to maintain order on my bus. Whose order? The kind that keeps decent people feeling safe." Samuel Brooks looked down at his 12-year-old son, who was staring up at him with the sort of confusion that comes when children first realize that the world doesn't operate on the principles of fairness they've been taught to expect. "Come on, Cameron," Samuel said quietly. "We'll walk." They got off the bus in the middle of a Detroit winter with 3 miles still to go before they reached home. As the bus pulled away, Cameron looked up at his father. "Dad, why did he make us get off? We didn't do anything wrong." Samuel Brooks stopped walking and knelt down so he was at eye level with his son. "Cameron, I want you to listen carefully to what I'm about to tell you, because it's one of the most important lessons you'll ever learn." Snow was beginning to fall, and Cameron pulled his thin jacket tighter. There are people in this world who will look at you and decide you don't belong somewhere before you even speak. They'll decide you're dangerous or suspicious or inferior based on nothing more than the color of your skin and their own fear of what they don't understand. That's not fair. No, son, it's not fair. But it's reality. And the question isn't whether it's fair, the question is what you're going to do about it. Cameron looked back at the bus disappearing into the distance. What can I do about it? Samuel Brooks smiled, and despite the cold and the injustice and the long walk ahead, there was something in that smile that suggested depths of strength Cameron was only beginning to understand. You can become so competent, so expert, so undeniably qualified that they can't dismiss you without looking like fools. You can master your chosen field so completely that when someone questions your right to be somewhere, everyone else knows they're the problem, not you. But Dad, you already know electronics better than anyone. You teach other people, that's right, and that bus driver still kicked us off because someone felt uncomfortable with our presence. Samuel stood up and started walking again. Cameron, when you look like us, competence isn't enough. You have to be twice as good to get half the respect. You have to know more, work harder, and perform better just to be considered equal. That's not fair either. No, it's not. But it's the game we're playing, and if we're going to win, we need to understand the rules. They walked in silence for several blocks, passing auto plants and strip malls and the kind of working-class Detroit neighborhoods where people understood that life wasn't fair, but you played the hand you were dealt anyway. Dad Cameron said eventually, "What field am I going to master?" Samuel looked down at the library book his son was still carrying. "What interests you most how things work, especially complicated things like airplanes and computers, and how to make them work better? How to fix them when they break?" Samuel nodded. "Then that's what you'll master. Fixing things, making them work better. Understanding systems so completely that when something goes wrong, you're the person everyone turns to for answers. Even if they don't want to turn to me, especially then. Because when systems fail, when emergencies happen, when lives are at stake, competence trumps prejudice. Excellence silences doubt." That night, Cameron Brooks made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would become so expert in complex systems, aircraft systems specifically, that no one could question his right to be wherever those systems needed him to be. He spent the next 6 years earning perfect grades while working part-time jobs to help support his family. He won a full scholarship to the Air Force Academy, where he encountered classmates who questioned whether he belonged, but he couldn't argue with his performance in advanced aeronautical engineering courses. He served 8 years as an Air Force pilot and engineer flying missions in Bosnia and Iraq, while earning advanced degrees in aeronautical engineering and aviation safety management. He left the military as a major with commendations for technical expertise and leadership under pressure. He joined Vanguard Airlines as a junior safety analyst and worked his way up through sheer competence, becoming the youngest chief flight training officer in the company's history. He'd written training manuals that were used industry-wide, developed safety procedures that had prevented countless accidents, and earned a reputation as the person you called when complex aircraft systems failed in ways no one had seen before. Cameron Brooks had spent 30 years becoming the person his 12-year-old self had promised he would become, so qualified that dismissing him would be obviously absurd. But Victoria Hamilton had tried anyway, and Captain Jake Morrison had almost let her succeed. Now, as Cameron explained manual hydraulic procedures to pilots who were beginning to understand that their lives, and the lives of 300 passengers, depended on expertise they'd nearly rejected. He thought about that 12-year-old boy walking through Detroit snow with his father. "Excellence silences doubt," his father had said. It was time to prove it. Captain Morrison Cameron said, his voice carrying 30 years of earned authority. "Let's begin your education." Outside, the storm intensified and the hydraulic pressure continued its steady decline toward catastrophic failure. While Cameron Brooks was teaching Captain Morrison how to save 300 lives, Victoria Hamilton was making increasingly frantic phone calls in a desperate attempt to salvage her crumbling sense of reality. "Richard," she hissed into her phone, her voice barely controlled. I need you to contact someone at the Department of Transportation immediately. This airline is compromising passenger safety by allowing suspicious individuals to Victoria." The voice of federal judge Richard Hamilton cut through his wife's tirade with the sort of judicial authority that had silenced courtrooms for 20 years. "Stop talking, right now." Victoria blinked, momentarily stunned by the sharp command in her husband's voice. "Richard, you don't understand. There's a man on this plane with technical manuals, and when I reported it, Victoria, I said, stop talking. But I know exactly who you're talking about. I know exactly what you've done. And I know exactly how much trouble you're in." Victoria's voice became smaller, uncertain. "What do you mean you know who I'm talking about, Dr. Cameron Brooks, Chief Flight Training Officer, Vanguard Airlines, recipient of the FAA's Distinguished Service Award in 2019, author of the emergency response protocols that saved a plane full of passengers in Frankfurt last year, former Air Force major with commendations for technical expertise under pressure." Each fact hit Victoria like a physical blow. How do you know all that she whispered? Because Victoria Dr. Brooks testified as an expert witness in my courtroom 3 years ago during the lawsuit against Continental Air. He single-handedly proved that mechanical failure, not pilot error, caused the emergency landing that injured 43 passengers. His testimony was brilliant, comprehensive, and delivered with the sort of quiet competence that made everyone in that courtroom understand they were listening to genuine expertise. Victoria's world tilted sideways. "That's impossible." "What's impossible, Victoria, is that my wife just spent 20 minutes trying to have him removed from an aircraft for the crime of being competent while black." The words hung between them like a chasm opening in the earth. "Richard, this has nothing to do with race, Victoria. I'm watching social media right now. Your meltdown is trending on Twitter. Victoria Hamilton is the number 3 hashtag in the country. There are videos of you demanding that an expert be removed for studying technical manuals. There are recordings of you calling him a terrorist for reading job-related documentation." Victoria looked around the cabin. Several passengers were still filming. Riley's live stream was now approaching 50,000 viewers. The hashtag Vanguard Shame had been joined by Victoria Hamilton and racist Karen, all trending nationally. "How is this my fault?" Victoria's voice cracked. "I was trying to protect people, Victoria. You were trying to remove the most qualified person on that aircraft because you couldn't handle sitting next to a black man in first class." "That's not—" "I never, Victoria, listen very carefully. I'm going to say this once, and then I'm going to hang up, and then I'm going to call my lawyer to discuss damage control options." Victoria gripped the phone tighter. "You have just created a public relations nightmare that will follow both of us for the rest of our lives. You have been recorded making false accusations against a respected aviation professional. You have demonstrated the sort of casual racism that destroys careers and reputations." "Richard, I'm not finished. Dr. Brooks has every right to sue you for defamation, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Vanguard Airlines has every right to ban you from their flights permanently. The federal government has every right to charge you with filing false reports and interfering with flight operations." Victoria's face was now completely white. "You're supposed to support me." "Victoria, I'm supposed to uphold justice. And what you did today was the opposite of justice. So you're taking his side. I'm taking the side of competence over prejudice, facts over assumptions, and basic human decency over entitled racism." The phone went dead. Victoria stared at the device in her hand, unable to process that her husband, her federal judge husband, who was supposed to be her ultimate protection against consequences, had just abandoned her completely. She immediately dialed another number, her attorney. "Patricia Schultz, Law Offices." "Patricia, this is Victoria Hamilton. I need you to Mrs. Hamilton." Patricia's voice was cold, professional, and notably lacking its usual deference. "I've been watching the news. Our firm will not be able to represent you in any matters related to today's incident." Why not?" "Because, Mrs. Hamilton, you've created a liability exposure that exceeds our malpractice insurance coverage. Also, because Dr. Brooks sits on the Aviation Safety Advisory Board that our firm consults for our airline industry clients. You can't abandon me, Mrs. Hamilton. We're not abandoning you. We're declining to represent you in a case where you are clearly and obviously in the wrong, where your actions were recorded and broadcast live, and where any attempt at defense would require us to argue positions that are legally untenable and morally reprehensible." Patricia paused. "I suggest you find an attorney who specializes in crisis management and public apologies. You're going to need both." The line went dead. Victoria tried calling her social circle the wives of other federal judges, the women who served on charity boards with her, the people who had always validated her sense of importance and entitlement. None of them answered their phones. Because by now, Victoria Hamilton wasn't just trending on social media. She was becoming the face of entitled racism in America. Her name was being discussed on cable news shows. Aviation industry publications were covering the story. Civil rights organizations were issuing statements. And in first-class cabin of Flight 847, she was sitting next to an empty seat because the man she'd tried to have removed was currently in the cockpit saving her life. Riley Davis provided real-time updates to her live-stream audience. So this racist lady's husband just hung up on her, her lawyer just fired her, and none of her friends are taking her calls. Meanwhile, the man she tried to get kicked off the plane is literally in the cockpit right now, fixing whatever's wrong with the aircraft systems. Comments poured injustice in real time. Karma is beautiful. Her privilege just evaporated. This is the best thing I've ever watched. Victoria Hamilton looked out the window at the storm and realized she was experiencing something she'd never felt before in her entire privileged life, genuine consequences for her actions. No amount of money could fix this. No amount of influence could undo this. No amount of entitlement could erase this. She had destroyed her own reputation on live television while trying to remove the one person qualified to keep her alive. And the worst part, the plane hadn't even taken off yet. In the cockpit of Flight 847, the situation was deteriorating with mathematical precision. Primary hydraulic pressure down to 60%. First Officer David Rodriguez reported his voice tight with controlled tension. Temperature warning lights on both primary and secondary systems. Cameron Brooks studied the displays with the focused intensity of someone reading a language most people didn't know existed. His fingers moved across diagnostic controls, calling up data screens that revealed the aircraft's vital signs in real time. "Captain Morrison, what I'm about to explain will determine whether we take off safely, land safely, or become a case study in aviation emergency management." Jake Morrison nodded, his earlier confidence completely replaced by the humility that comes with realizing you're in over your head. "I'm listening." The Boeing 787's hydraulic system operates on 3 independent circuits. Cameron began, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd taught these principles hundreds of times. Primary, secondary, and backup. Under normal conditions, primary handles about 60% of the load. Secondary handles 30%, and backup remains in standby. "I know the basic system architecture," Jake said. "Knowing the architecture and understanding the failure modes are different things," Cameron replied. "In cold weather operations, hydraulic fluid viscosity increases, which requires higher pressure to maintain normal flow rates. The system compensates by increasing pump output, which generates heat which creates thermal stress on valve seals." David looked up from his instruments. "Primary system just dropped to 55%. Cameron nodded. "Right on schedule. Captain, what we're experiencing is a cascade failure. Cold weather is causing valve seals to stiffen. Stiff seals cause pressure loss. Pressure loss triggers increased pump output. Increased pump output creates heat and additional stress. Eventually, the pumps burn out, the valves lock, and we lose hydraulic authority entirely." "How long do we have?" Jake asked. Cameron checked his calculations against the current readings. "At this rate of deterioration, 15 minutes until primary system failure. 25 minutes until secondary system failure. After that, we'll be operating on manual backup systems only. Can we fly on manual backup, Captain Morrison? Manual backup will give us basic flight control authority and emergency landing gear deployment. It will not give us normal braking, normal steering, or normal system redundancy. Cameron's voice remained steady. Landing an aircraft of this size on manual backup systems in a storm at night requires skills that aren't covered in standard training. Jake felt sweat gathering under his collar despite the cool cabin temperature. What are our options? We have two choices. We can declare an emergency, ground the aircraft, and wait for maintenance to replace the entire hydraulic system, which will take 12 hours minimum. Or we can execute the manual hydraulic emergency procedure I developed after Frankfurt. What does that procedure involve? Cameron turned to face Jake directly. It involves manually bleeding the hydraulic system while in flight, purging the cold-affected fluid and repressurizing using backup pumps in a sequence that's not in any standard manual. That sounds incredibly dangerous. Captain Morrison, everything we do from this point forward is dangerous. The question is whether we choose controlled danger managed by expertise or uncontrolled danger managed by hope. David's voice cut through the tension. Secondary system pressure dropping. We're down to 48% on primary. Cameron moved to the auxiliary controls. Captain, I need you to make a decision right now. Do you trust me to guide you through procedures that aren't in your training manual, but could save 300 lives? Jake Morrison looked at Cameron. Brooks really looked at him. This was the man he'd been ready to remove from the aircraft 20 minutes ago because a racist passenger found his competence suspicious. This was the man whose expertise Victoria Hamilton had characterized as terrorist behavior. This was also the man who currently represented the difference between a successful flight and a catastrophic emergency. Dr. Brooks, Jake said, "I trust you completely." Good. First Officer Rodriguez, I need you to access the auxiliary hydraulic control panel. It's behind the panel to your right, the one marked Authorized Personnel Only. David hesitated. Sir, that panel requires maintenance authorization codes. Cameron rattled off a 12-digit sequence from memory. Authorization code Alpha 77 Delta 9, 9, 2 Charlie 45, 8 Bravo. David input the code. The panel opened to reveal a set of controls that weren't covered in any training program either pilot had ever attended. Captain Morrison, Cameron continued, what I'm about to teach you is the manual hydraulic emergency procedure. You will learn it, you will practice it, and when the time comes, you will execute it perfectly. What if I can't? Cameron's voice carried a note of absolute certainty. Captain, failure is not an option. We have 300 passengers, including children, elderly travelers, and yes, even Victoria Hamilton. Every one of them deserves to reach their destination safely regardless of their character flaws or prejudicial assumptions. In the cabin, passengers were beginning to sense that something unusual was happening. The normal pre-flight routine had been disrupted. Flight attendants were moving with more urgency. There were voices from the cockpit that suggested serious conversation rather than routine checklists. Riley's live stream viewer count jumped to 5,000. Comments began flowing in real time. Is this really happening? She just called him a terrorist for reading. This is insane. Vanguard shame, Victoria. Hamilton overheard and felt a new kind of fear creeping in. Not the fabricated fear she'd used to justify her racism, but genuine fear based on the growing realization that the man she'd tried to have removed might be the only thing standing between her and disaster. In the cockpit, Cameron was walking Jake and David through diagnostic procedures with the patience of a master teacher and the urgency of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. The key to this procedure, Cameron explained, is that we're going to manually control hydraulic pressure using backup pumps while simultaneously bleeding the system of cold-affected fluid. It requires precise timing, constant communication, and absolute trust in the process. Primary system is down to 40%, David reported. Cameron checked his calculations. We're running out of time for normal departure procedures. Captain Morrison, you need to contact air traffic control and request immediate takeoff clearance. In this storm, Captain, we're going to lose primary hydraulic authority, whether we're on the ground or in the air. I would rather execute emergency procedures at altitude with full engine power than attempt them during taxi and takeoff when we have the least control authority. Jake keyed his radio. Miami Tower Vanguard 847 requesting immediate departure clearance. We have developing hydraulic issues that require altitude for emergency procedures. Vanguard 847, understand hydraulic issues. Are you declaring emergency? Jake looked at Cameron, who shook his head slightly. Tower not declaring emergency at this time. Requesting immediate clearance for developing mechanical issue requiring altitude. Vanguard 847 cleared immediate takeoff runway 27. Contact departure on 124.7. Cameron nodded approvingly. Good decision, Captain. Now comes the hard part. What's the hard part? Taking off with a failing hydraulic system while preparing to execute emergency procedures that I'm going to teach you in real time while managing passenger safety and maintaining aircraft control. Jake Morrison felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. Dr. Brooks, what would have happened if Mrs. Hamilton had succeeded in having you removed? Cameron's answer was delivered with the calm certainty of someone who understood aircraft systems better than most people understood their own cars. Captain Morrison, if I had been removed from this aircraft, you would currently be facing a hydraulic emergency with no qualified support, no advanced procedures, and no realistic chance of landing safely. The engines spun up for takeoff, and the primary hydraulic system pressure dropped below 40%. Time was up. Flight 847 thundered down runway 27 with primary hydraulic pressure at 35% and dropping while Cameron Brooks calmly guided Captain Morrison through the most complex emergency procedure in commercial aviation. V1, David Rodriguez, called out confirming they'd reached the speed where aborting takeoff would be more dangerous than continuing. Rotate Jake responded, pulling back on the yoke as the massive 787 lifted off into the storm. Immediately, the hydraulic warning klaxons began blaring. Primary hydraulic failure, David announced, his voice tight with controlled panic. Secondary system showing stress indicators. We're down to manual backup only. In the cabin, passengers felt the unusual vibration and heard the warning tones. Conversations stopped. Overhead, bins rattled more than normal. The aircraft's climb felt different, less smooth, more labored. Riley Davis whispered into her live stream, "Something is definitely wrong with this plane. We just took off, and there are warning sounds coming from everywhere." Her viewer count had climbed past 75,000. The hashtags Vanguard Emergency and Flight 847 were trending alongside Victoria Hamilton. Sophia Martinez moved through the cabin with professional calm, but passengers who knew how to read flight attendant body language could see the tension in her movements. Victoria Hamilton gripped her armrests with white knuckles, finally understanding that her racist tantrum had nearly removed the one person capable of keeping her alive. In the cockpit, Cameron was teaching advanced hydraulic emergency procedures in real time while monitoring system failures that were occurring exactly as he'd predicted. Captain Morrison Cameron said, his voice carrying absolute calm, despite the chaos of warning lights and klaxons. "I need you to access the manual hydraulic override controls. They're located on the pedestal between your seats covered by the red safety panel." Jake found the panel. "I see it. Break the safety seal and open it." Jake hesitated. Breaking that seal meant acknowledging they were in a full emergency situation requiring procedures not covered in any standard training. Captain Cameron's voice carried a note of gentle authority. "The seal is there to prevent accidental access during normal operations. These are not normal operations." Jake broke the seal and opened the panel, revealing controls that looked like something from a spacecraft rather than a commercial airliner. First Officer Rodriguez Cameron continued, "I need you to monitor secondary hydraulic pressure while Captain Morrison executes the manual override sequence. Secondary pressure is at 60% and holding David reported." "Good. That gives us a window. Captain, on my mark, you're going to activate the manual hydraulic pump override. This will give us temporary pressure restoration, but only if we execute the sequence perfectly." Through the cockpit speakers, air traffic control crackled, "Vanguard 847, we show emergency squawk. Confirm aircraft status." Cameron nodded to Jake. "Tell them we're managing a developing hydraulic situation and will advise." Jake keyed the radio. "Departure, Vanguard 847 is managing hydraulic anomaly. Not declaring emergency at this time. Will advise if status changes. Vanguard 847 understood. You're cleared to 15,000, maintain heading 270. Emergency equipment is on standby. In the cabin, passengers were beginning to understand that something serious was happening. The flight attendants were securing the cabin with unusual urgency. There were hushed conversations on the aircraft phones. Riley's live stream chat was exploding. Are they going to crash? This is terrifying. Thank God that racist lady didn't get the expert removed. She almost killed everyone. Marshal Rodriguez had taken a position where he could monitor both the passenger cabin and coordinate with cockpit if necessary. His training in aerial emergencies was about to become very relevant. Victoria Hamilton was experiencing something she'd never felt before. Genuine fear combined with the devastating realization that her own prejudice had nearly caused a catastrophe. She pulled out her phone and for the first time in the entire incident typed a message to social media that wasn't about her own comfort. I was wrong. Dr. Brooks is saving lives. I almost got us all killed because of my assumptions. I'm sorry. It was too little too late, but it was the first truthful thing she'd said all evening. In the cockpit, Cameron was walking Jake through procedures that required split-second timing and absolute precision. Captain Morrison, the manual hydraulic restoration procedure involves 3 phases. Phase 1 system bleed to remove contaminated fluid. Phase 2 pressure restoration using backup pumps. Phase 3 system test to confirm normal operation. How long for each phase? Phase 1 takes 30 seconds and requires perfect timing. Phase 2 takes 2 minutes and requires constant monitoring. Phase 3 takes 30 seconds and will determine whether we land normally or execute emergency landing procedures. David's voice cut through the explanation. Secondary system pressure dropping. We're down to 50%. Cameron checked his calculations. We're right on schedule. Captain, we need to begin Phase 1 immediately. What do I need to do? On my mark, you'll activate the system bleed valve for exactly 15 seconds, then close it. Too short, and we don't clear the contaminated fluid. Too long, and we lose too much pressure to restart. Jake's hand hovered over the control. Ready. Cameron watched the pressure gauges, the temperature indicators, and the system flow meters with the focused attention of a surgeon monitoring vital signs during a critical operation. Mark, Cameron said. Jake activated the bleed valve. Hydraulic fluid began draining from the system at a controlled rate, carrying with it the cold, thickened fluid that had been causing the cascade failure. Cameron counted down. 10 seconds, 5 seconds, mark. Jake closed the valve. Perfect execution, Cameron said. Phase 2 begins now. First Officer Rodriguez, I need you to activate backup pump alpha on my mark. Standing by, David responded. Mark. David engaged the backup pump. Fresh hydraulic fluid began flowing through the system, but the pressure gauges showed erratic readings as the system struggled to establish normal flow. Is it working? Jake asked. Cameron studied the displays. It's working, but we're not out of danger yet. The system is trying to establish new pressure equilibrium. If it succeeds, we'll have normal hydraulic authority. If it fails... He didn't finish the sentence. If it fails, Jake prompted. If it fails, Captain Morrison will execute emergency landing procedures using manual backup systems only. And we'll do it in a storm at night with passengers who are already afraid. The cockpit fell silent except for the sounds of systems fighting to restore normal operation and the steady drumbeat of rain against the windscreen. In the cabin, passengers could sense that the critical moment had arrived. The aircraft felt different. Either they were about to return to normal flight, or things were about to get much worse. Riley whispered to her 78,000 viewers, "This is it. Either Dr. Brooks just saved us all, or we're about to find out what emergency landing procedures look like." Victoria Hamilton closed her eyes and for the first time in years prayed to something other than her own importance. And in the cockpit, hydraulic pressure gauges slowly, steadily began climbing toward normal. Phase 2 complete, Cameron announced. Pressure restoration successful. Beginning Phase 3 system verification. Jake Morrison realized he'd been holding his breath. Dr. Brooks did. Captain, we just proved that competence trumps assumptions every single time," Cameron replied. "Now, let's get these passengers safely to Seattle." The hydraulic pressure gauge hit 100% normal, and for the first time in 40 minutes, the cockpit of Flight 847 fell silent except for the steady hum of properly functioning systems. Captain Jake Morrison stared at the instruments, hardly believing what he was seeing. "Doctor Brooks, we just executed a manual hydraulic system restoration in flight during adverse weather conditions," Cameron confirmed, which, by the way, has only been successfully completed 7 times in commercial aviation history. David Rodriguez was grinning despite himself. And now it's 8 times. Cameron stood up from the flight engineer's position. "Captain Morrison, you need to make an announcement to the passengers. They've been through enough uncertainty." Jake nodded and reached for the intercom, but Cameron stopped him. "Captain, before you address the passengers, there's something you need to understand about what just happened." "What do you mean?" Cameron's voice carried the weight of 30 years in aviation safety. 45 minutes ago, you were prepared to remove me from this aircraft because Mrs. Hamilton was uncomfortable with my presence. If you had succeeded, if I had been forced to leave this plane, what would have happened when the hydraulic crisis developed? Jake's face went pale as the implications sank in. "We would have had to declare an emergency and attempt landing with no qualified support. Captain Morrison, you would have been forced to attempt emergency procedures you'd never been trained on with systems you didn't fully understand, carrying 300 passengers who were depending on your expertise." David looked up from his instruments. "How many people would have? In similar circumstances with inadequately trained crews attempting complex emergency procedures?" Cameron's voice was matter-of-fact. "Historical data suggests survival rates of approximately 40%. The cockpit fell silent as both pilots processed what that meant. 180 fatalities, Jake whispered. "Because I was more concerned with passenger comfort than crew competence." Cameron nodded. "Captain, what you nearly did wasn't just accommodate a racist complaint. You nearly removed the most qualified person on this aircraft to handle the exact emergency we just experienced." Jake Morrison felt the full weight of his near-catastrophic error settling on his shoulders. "Dr. Brooks, I don't know how to—" "Captain, you learn from it. You ensure it never happens again. And you use your authority to protect competence rather than privilege prejudice." Cameron moved toward the cockpit door. "Now, make your announcement. These passengers deserve to understand what happened and why they're safe." Jake keyed the intercom system. His voice, when he spoke, carried a humility that hadn't been there an hour earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Morrison speaking. I want to personally address the events of this evening, both on the ground and in the air." In the cabin, passengers stopped their conversations. Phones came out to record. Riley's live stream audience climbed past 100,000 viewers. Approximately 1 hour ago, we experienced a passenger complaint in first class. A passenger demanded that we remove another passenger doctor, Cameron Brooks, based on her discomfort with his presence and his reading material. Victoria Hamilton shrank lower in her seat, knowing that every passenger was now looking at her. "I initially considered accommodating that request." Jake continued, his voice steady, but carrying unmistakable regret. "I was wrong to consider it, and I owe Dr. Brooks and all of you an apology." Cameron had returned to his seat, but passengers were turning to look at him with new understanding. 30 minutes ago, Jake's voice continued over the intercom. "We developed a serious hydraulic system emergency that required immediate intervention using procedures not covered in standard pilot training." A collective intake of breath swept through the cabin. "Doctor." Cameron, Brooks Vanguard Airlines Chief Flight Training Officer, guided us through emergency procedures that saved this aircraft and everyone on board. The man that Mrs. Hamilton demanded we remove for suspicious behavior quite literally saved our lives. Riley whispered to her live stream audience, "Holy shit." The racist lady almost got everyone killed by trying to remove the one guy who could save them. Victoria Hamilton was now crying not from self-pity but from the devastating realization of what her prejudice had nearly cost. Sophia Martinez approached Cameron's seat with tears in her eyes. Dr. Brooks, on behalf of the entire crew, I want to thank you for saving us all. Sophia, you don't need to thank me. This is what I do. No, sir, this is who you are. And we're all alive because Mrs. Hamilton didn't succeed in having you removed." Around the cabin, passengers began to applaud. Not the polite applause of entertainment, but the kind of deep, grateful applause that comes from people who understand they've witnessed genuine heroism. Cameron raised his hand to quiet the applause. "Ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate your gratitude, but there's something important you need to understand." The cabin fell silent. What happened today wasn't about one person's heroic actions. It was about the consequences of assumptions. Mrs. Hamilton saw a black man reading technical manuals and assumed I was suspicious. Captain Morrison initially prioritized her comfort over crew competence. Both of those decisions nearly resulted in a tragedy that would have cost hundreds of lives. Cameron stood so everyone could see him. The lesson here isn't that I'm special. The lesson is that competence doesn't have a color, expertise doesn't have a look, and qualification can't be determined by appearance or assumptions. He looked directly at Victoria Hamilton, who was now openly weeping. "Mrs. Hamilton, you nearly caused a catastrophe because you couldn't accept that someone who looks like me might belong in first class. But here's what I want you to understand. I don't need your permission to be qualified. I don't need your comfort to be competent. And I certainly don't need your approval to save your life." Victoria looked up at him through her tears. "Dr. Brooks, I'm so sorry. I was wrong. I was completely, horribly wrong." Cameron's voice softened slightly. "Mrs. Hamilton, apologies are a beginning, not an ending. The question is what you do with this experience. Do you learn from it, or do you find new ways to justify old assumptions?" Riley's livestream chat was moving so fast it was unreadable, but the sentiment was clear. This man is incredible. Teaching moments at 30,000 feet. Dignity in the face of racism. This is how leaders handle ignorance. Captain Morrison's voice returned to the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're continuing to Seattle with all systems normal. We expect to land on schedule. And I want to personally ensure that Dr. Brooks receives the recognition he deserves for his expertise and professionalism." Cameron returned to his seat and reopened his technical manual, as if saving 300 lives was simply another day at the office. But around him, the atmosphere in first class had completely transformed. Passengers who had witnessed blatant racism, followed by incredible competence, were processing what they'd seen. Some were recording video messages about the experience. Others were writing social media posts about Dr. Cameron Brooks and his grace under pressure. Victoria Hamilton sat in her seat no longer the entitled socialite who had boarded the plane, but a woman confronting the ugly reality of her own prejudices and their potential consequences. And Flight 847 continued towards Seattle, carrying passengers who would never forget the night they witnessed racism, challenged by competence assumptions defeated by expertise, and quiet dignity triumph over loud prejudice. The storm was beginning to clear and the aircraft flew on through smooth skies, systems functioning normally, passengers safe, and one very important lesson learned by everyone on board. Cameron Brooks returned to his reading, making notes in red ink, preparing for the London flight where his expertise would be needed once again. Because that's what competence does. It shows up, it performs, and it doesn't need applause to validate its worth. By the time Flight 847 reached cruising altitude, Victoria Hamilton's racist meltdown had become a global phenomenon. Riley Davis's live stream had peaked at over 200,000 simultaneous viewers before she'd been asked by flight attendants to end the broadcast for security reasons. But the damage was done, or rather the justice was served. The hashtag Victoria Hamilton was trending in 12 countries. Cable news networks had picked up the story. Aviation industry publications were running headlines about racism in air travel. Civil rights organizations were issuing statements. Corporate communications teams across the airline industry were holding emergency meetings. And Victoria Hamilton was discovering what it felt like to be held accountable for her actions without the protective buffer of wealth and privilege. Her phone buzzed with text messages from friends, family, and acquaintances. None of them were supportive. Her sister Victoria, "What the hell were you thinking, Mom?" is mortified. Her country club president, Victoria, the board is meeting tomorrow to discuss your membership status. Her charity organization's Mrs. Hamilton. We're receiving calls from donors expressing concern about your association with our organization. Even her personal assistant, Mrs. Hamilton, I'm resigning effective immediately. I can't work for someone whose values are so fundamentally opposed to my own. But the most devastating message came from her husband's law firm, Mrs. Hamilton. Judge Hamilton has asked us to inform you that he will be filing for divorce immediately upon his return to Miami. He has also asked us to inform you that he will not be providing legal representation or financial support for any consequences arising from today's incident. Victoria stared at her phone, unable to process the complete collapse of her social and financial safety net. Meanwhile, Dr. Cameron Brooks was receiving a very different kind of attention. His phone buzzed with messages from colleagues, aviation safety organizations, and media outlets wanting to interview him about his expertise and professionalism. The Airline Pilots Association Dr. Brooks, your handling of today's emergency exemplifies the highest standards of aviation professionalism. We would like to nominate you for our Distinguished Service Award. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People Dr. Brooks, your grace under pressure and commitment to saving lives regardless of personal insult represents the best of American values. We would be honored to recognize your service. NASA's Aviation Safety Research Center Dr. Brooks, we would like to discuss incorporating your manual hydraulic procedures into our advanced safety training protocols. Even the president of Vanguard Airlines, Cameron. I've been watching the news coverage. Your professionalism today represents everything our company stands for. We're promoting you to Vice President of Aviation Safety effective immediately. But Cameron's response to all the attention was characteristically understated. He replied to each message with professional courtesy, but his focus remained on the technical manual in his lap and the job that still needed to be done. Sophia Martinez approached his seat with a bottle of champagne. Dr. Brooks, this is from the captain. He wanted to express his gratitude. Cameron looked at the bottle. Sophia, please tell Captain Morrison that I appreciate the gesture, but I don't drink alcohol while on duty. You're not on duty, sir. You're a passenger. Cameron smiled slightly. Sophia, when you're responsible for aviation safety, you're always on duty. Across the cabin, passengers were having quiet conversations about what they'd witnessed. The elderly man from 3A, Dr. Martinez, approached Cameron's seat. Dr. Brooks, I've been working in aviation safety for 30 years. What you did today, both the technical expertise and the personal dignity, that's what leadership looks like. Cameron nodded respectfully. Dr. Martinez, thank you. But what happened today shouldn't be remarkable. Competence should be recognized regardless of packaging. You're right. But we don't live in the world we should. We live in the world we do. And in the world we do, what you did matters. A young father traveling with his daughter stopped by Cameron's seat. Dr. Brooks, my daughter, asked me to tell you that when she grows up, she wants to be smart like you. Cameron looked at the little girl who was maybe 8 years old, and his expression softened. What's your name, Emma? She said shyly. Emma, being smart is important, but being kind is more important. And being brave enough to use your intelligence to help others, even when they're not kind to you, that's the most important thing of all. The little girl nodded solemnly and returned to her father. Victoria Hamilton overheard the conversation and felt another wave of shame wash over her. She had tried to remove this man from the aircraft, and he was teaching children about kindness and forgiveness. Marshal Rodriguez stopped by Victoria's seat. Mrs. Hamilton, I wanted to inform you that federal charges are being considered for filing false reports and interference with flight operations. Victoria's voice was small. What kind of charges? Potentially up to 5 years in federal prison and substantial fines. The U.S. Attorney's Office is reviewing the video evidence. Victoria closed her eyes. Her world wasn't just changing, it was ending. Everything she'd built her identity around, her social status, her financial security, her sense of entitlement. All of it was crumbling because she couldn't handle sitting next to a black man in first class, Marshal Rodriguez. She said quietly, what would Dr. Brooks have to do to make this go away? Rodriguez looked at her with something between pity and disgust. Mrs. Hamilton, Dr. Brooks doesn't have to do anything. He's not the one who committed federal crimes. He's not the one who filed false reports. He's the victim of your actions, not the solution to your consequences. Could I ask him to, ma'am? You could ask. But based on what I've observed of Dr. Brooks's character, I suspect he'll tell you that consequences are how people learn, and learning is how society improves. Rodriguez was right. When Victoria finally worked up the courage to approach Cameron's seat, his response was exactly what the marshal had predicted. Mrs. Hamilton Cameron said without looking up from his manual, "You're asking me to help you avoid consequences for actions that could have resulted in the deaths of 300 people. The answer is no. Dr. Brooks, please. I'm sorry, I was wrong. I'll do anything." Cameron looked up at her then, and his eyes held not anger, but something worse, disappointment. "Mrs. Hamilton, you had the opportunity to do anything when you chose to make assumptions about my qualifications based on my appearance. You chose prejudice over facts, comfort over competence, privilege over justice. Now you face the consequences of those choices." He returned to his reading. "I suggest you use this experience to become a better person rather than to find ways to avoid accountability." Victoria returned to her seat alone in a way she'd never been before in her privileged life. And Flight 847 continued toward Seattle carrying a cabin full of passengers who had witnessed both the worst and the best of human nature in the span of 2 hours. While Flight 847 cruised toward Seattle, the reverberations of Victoria Hamilton's racist meltdown and Cameron Brooks's heroic response were creating waves of change throughout the aviation industry and beyond. In Vanguard Airlines' corporate headquarters, CEO Margaret Torres was leading an emergency board meeting that would reshape company policy for years to come. "Ladies and gentlemen," Torres announced to the assembled executives, "what happened on Flight 847 tonight represents both a near catastrophe and an unprecedented opportunity. We nearly lost 300 lives because of racial prejudice interfering with operational competence." She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, the Brooks Protocol Comprehensive Anti-Discrimination and Competence Protection Initiative. Effective immediately, Vanguard Airlines is implementing the most comprehensive anti-bias training program in commercial aviation history. Every employee from ground crew to senior executives will undergo mandatory training designed to ensure that competence is recognized and protected, regardless of appearance, race, or passenger complaints. Board member Richard Stevens raised his hand. "Margaret, what's the financial exposure from today's incident?" Torres clicked to the next slide, showing social media analytics. "Richard, as of 30 minutes ago, Victoria Hamilton has been tweeted 2.3 million times. Vanguard shame has been shared across every major social platform. We're facing a potential public relations catastrophe that could cost hundreds of millions in lost revenue." However, she continued clicking to the next slide, Dr. Cameron Brooks's professionalism and heroism have also generated Vanguard heroes, which is trending equally strongly. We have an opportunity to turn this crisis into a leadership moment. CFO Diana Martinez leaned forward. "What specifically are you proposing first immediate implementation of bias intervention protocols? Any passenger complaint targeting crew or passengers based on appearance or assumptions will trigger mandatory review by qualified personnel before any action is taken." Torres clicked to implementation timeline. "Second, comprehensive training for all customer-facing employees on recognizing competence versus making assumptions. Flight attendants, gate agents, customer service representatives. Everyone learns to identify expertise and protect it. Third, establishment of the Cameron Brooks Center for Aviation Excellence, a training facility dedicated to ensuring that incidents like tonight never happen again." She paused for emphasis. "And fourth, Dr. Brooks has agreed to serve as our new Vice President of Aviation Safety and Bias Prevention, with authority to implement industry-wide standards that other airlines will be forced to adopt or be left behind." In the cabin of Flight 847, Cameron was receiving real-time updates about the changes his actions had set in motion. His phone buzzed with a text from FAA Administrator Patricia Coleman. Dr. Brooks, the Federal Aviation Administration is fast-tracking regulation changes based on tonight's incident. We're implementing mandatory bias recognition training for all commercial aviation personnel within 6 months. Another message from the International Air Transport Association. Dr. Brooks, IATA, is adopting your manual hydraulic procedures as standard emergency protocols worldwide. We're also establishing anti-discrimination guidelines for passenger management. Even the Department of Transportation, Dr. Brooks' Secretary Martinez, would like to discuss appointing you to lead a federal task force on equality and safety in commercial aviation. Cameron replied to each message professionally, but his focus remained on the larger implications of what was happening. Sophia Martinez approached his seat again. Dr. Brooks, I've been authorized by Captain Morrison to inform passengers about the new policies being implemented as a result of tonight's events. Cameron nodded. Go ahead, Sophia. Sophia activated the intercom system. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Sophia Martinez, your lead flight attendant. I wanted to update you on some important developments resulting from tonight's events. The cabin fell silent as passengers turned their attention to the announcement. Vanguard Airlines is implementing immediate policy changes to ensure that what happened to Dr. Brooks never happens again. First, any passenger complaints based on appearance or assumptions will be reviewed by qualified personnel before any action is taken. She paused to let that sink in. Second, all Vanguard employees will undergo comprehensive training to recognize and protect expertise regardless of how it's packaged. Riley Davis, who had been documenting the entire flight on social media even after ending her live stream, began typing furiously breaking Vanguard Air, implementing industry-changing policies because of Dr. Cameron Brooks' heroism and Victoria Hamilton racism. This is how progress happens when consequences meet competence. Aviation reform. Third, Sophia continued. Dr. Brooks has been promoted to Vice President of Aviation Safety with authority to implement these changes industry-wide. Applause erupted throughout the cabin. Even passengers in economy class who had been following the story through social media joined in the celebration. Cameron stood briefly and nodded to acknowledge the applause, then sat back down. But his expression suggested he understood the weight of responsibility that came with the recognition. Victoria Hamilton, hunched in her seat, was witnessing the transformation of an industry because of her racist assumptions. Every policy change, every new training protocol, every advancement in equality and fairness was a direct result of her attempt to remove competence because it came in black skin. Her phone buzzed with one final message, this one from her former husband's law firm, Mrs. Hamilton. Judge Hamilton wanted us to inform you that he's donating $100,000 to the Cameron Brooks Center for Aviation Excellence in your name. He said it's the least he can do to undo the damage you caused. The irony was crushing. Her racism hadn't just destroyed her life, it had generated positive change that would benefit thousands of future travelers and aviation professionals. As Flight 847 began its descent towards Seattle, Cameron was already working on implementation plans for the new policies. His technical manual was now filled with notes not just about hydraulic systems but about human systems, how to build structures that protected competence and prevented prejudice from interfering with safety. Captain Morrison's voice came over the intercom one final time. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our descent into Seattle. Tonight, you've witnessed something remarkable, not just technical expertise under pressure, but the kind of grace and professionalism that makes aviation safer for everyone. He paused. Dr. Cameron Brooks didn't just save this flight, he's changing this industry. And Mrs. Victoria Hamilton, whether she intended to or not, has become the catalyst for long overdue reforms that will benefit travelers for generations. As the plane descended through the clouds toward Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, passengers looked out their windows at a world that was subtly but meaningfully different than the one they'd left behind in Miami. Policies were changing. Training programs were being developed. Federal regulations were being rewritten. And it all started because one woman couldn't handle sitting next to a qualified black man, and one qualified black man chose to save her life anyway. The Brooks Protocol would be implemented across the aviation industry within 6 months. The Cameron Brooks Center for Aviation Excellence would train thousands of aviation professionals in both technical competence and bias recognition. And Victoria Hamilton would spend the rest of her life knowing that her moment of racist entitlement had accidentally catalyzed positive change she could never have imagined. Sometimes justice works in mysterious ways. As Flight 847 touched down at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, the passengers weren't just completing a journey from Miami to Seattle. They were finishing a transformation that had changed not just their own understanding of competence and character, but the aviation industry itself. Cameron Brooks gathered his technical manual and carry-on bag with the same quiet efficiency he'd shown throughout the entire ordeal. No drama, no celebration, just the understated competence that had saved 300 lives and sparked industry-wide reform. Sophia Martinez approached his seat one final time. "Dr. Brooks, on behalf of the entire crew, I want you to know that you've changed how we think about our jobs. We're not just serving passengers anymore. We're protecting competence and ensuring safety for everyone." Cameron looked up at her with the slight smile of someone who understood that real change happened one conversation at a time. "Sophia, you were already doing that. You just didn't realize it." "How do you mean?" "When Mrs. Hamilton made her accusations, you could have sided with her automatically. Instead, you documented the incident, called for review, and protected a passenger who was being targeted. That's not training, that's character." Sophia nodded, tears in her eyes. "Dr. Brooks, what you did tonight. How do you stay so calm when someone treats you like that?" Cameron stood adjusting his carry-on. Sophia's anger would have been justified. Indignation would have been understandable. But anger doesn't fix hydraulic systems. Indignation doesn't save lives. Competence does. He paused. The best response to prejudice isn't emotion, it's excellence. When someone assumes you don't belong somewhere, you prove you belong everywhere. Captain Jake Morrison emerged from the cockpit, still wearing the expression of someone who'd learned a life-changing lesson. He approached Cameron directly. "Dr. Brooks, I owe you more than gratitude. I owe you an apology and a promise." Cameron waited. "I almost removed the most qualified person on this aircraft because I was intimidated by a passenger's entitlement. That decision could have killed everyone on this plane." Jake's voice carried the weight of genuine remorse. "I promise you, and I promise every passenger who flies with me that will never happen again." Captain Morrison. Cameron replied, "You didn't almost make a mistake. You almost learned a lesson. The question isn't whether you made an error in judgment, the question is what you do with that knowledge." Jake nodded. "I've requested assignment to bias recognition training. I want to teach other pilots how to identify competence and protect it." "Good. Leadership isn't about avoiding mistakes. It's about turning mistakes into wisdom." As passengers began deplaning, many stopped to thank Cameron personally. The elderly aviation safety expert Dr. Martinez shook his hand warmly. "Dr. Brooks, in 30 years of aviation safety work, I've never seen someone handle crisis with such grace. You didn't just save lives, you preserved dignity." The young father with his 8-year-old daughter stopped as well. "Dr. Brooks, Emma has something she wants to say." The little girl looked up at Cameron seriously. "Mr. Cameron, my daddy says you're a hero. Are you really a hero?" Cameron knelt down to her eye level. "Emma, heroes are just people who use their skills to help others, even when it's difficult. The real question is, are you going to be a hero?" Emma nodded solemnly. "I want to help people like you do. Then, study hard, be kind to others, and remember that being smart is good, but using your intelligence to help people is even better." As Cameron stood, the father mouthed, "Thank you," and led his daughter toward the jet bridge. Marshal Rodriguez was the last official to speak with Cameron before deplaning. "Dr. Brooks, the federal investigation into Mrs. Hamilton's actions will require your testimony. Are you willing to participate?" Cameron considered the question. "Marshal Rodriguez, will my testimony help prevent similar incidents in the future?" Absolutely. Your statements will be used to develop federal guidelines for handling passenger discrimination complaints. Then yes, I'll testify. Not for punishment, but for prevention. Rodriguez nodded respectfully. Dr. Brooks, you've shown more class in 2 hours than most people show in a lifetime. Victoria Hamilton was the last passenger to deplane, moving slowly, as if each step took her further away from the person she used to be and closer to consequences she wasn't sure she could face. As she passed Cameron's seat, now empty, she stopped. Sophia Martinez noticed her hesitation. "Mrs. Hamilton, is everything all right?" Victoria looked at the seat where Cameron had sat reading his technical manuals demonstrating the competence she'd found so threatening. "He saved my life," she whispered. "After everything I said, everything I tried to do to him, he saved my life." Sophia's expression softened slightly. "Mrs. Hamilton, that's what competent people do. They solve problems regardless of how they're treated. I destroyed everything because I couldn't handle sitting next to someone who didn't look like me. And he saved everyone, including me." Victoria's voice broke. "How do I live with that, Mrs. Hamilton?" Sophia said gently. "You live with it by becoming someone worthy of the life he saved. You use this experience to become better." Victoria nodded and walked slowly toward the jet bridge, knowing she was walking into a world where her privilege could no longer protect her from the consequences of her choices. Cameron Brooks collected his belongings and walked off Flight 847 with the same quiet competence he'd shown throughout the entire ordeal. No media interviews waited for him, no celebration committee. Just the next flight to London, where his expertise would be needed to investigate hydraulic system improvements. But as he walked through Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, flight crews and gate agents recognized him from the social media coverage. They nodded respectfully. A few approached to thank him. One pilot saluted. Cameron acknowledged each gesture with professional courtesy, but his focus remained forward. There was work to do, systems to improve, people to train, industries to change, because that's what competence does. It doesn't seek recognition, it seeks results. His phone buzzed with one final message of the evening from his father in Detroit. "Son, I saw the news coverage. You remember what I told you when we got kicked off that bus 30 years ago?" Cameron smiled and typed back, "Excellence silences doubt." "That's right. And tonight, you didn't just silence doubt, you turned prejudice into progress. I'm proud of you." As Cameron walked toward his connecting gate, he passed a young black pilot in uniform who stopped him. "Dr. Brooks, I just wanted to say thank you. Because of what you did tonight, my daughter will grow up in an aviation industry that's safer and more fair." Cameron shook the young pilot's hand. "Captain, your daughter will grow up in that industry because we're all committed to making it better. Tonight was just one flight. Tomorrow we build the future." And with that doctor, Cameron Brooks continued toward his next flight, carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd turned a moment of ugliness into lasting change. Behind him, the aviation industry was already implementing policies that would protect competence and prevent prejudice from endangering lives. Ahead of him, London waited and the work continued. Because excellence never rests, it just flies on. 6 months later, the Cameron Brooks Center for Aviation Excellence had trained over 12,000 airline personnel in competence recognition and bias prevention. The Brooks Protocol had been adopted by every major carrier in the United States and was being implemented internationally by airlines seeking to demonstrate their commitment to both safety and equality. Victoria Hamilton's story became a case study taught in business schools and sensitivity training programs across the country, not as vilification but as education about the real-world consequences of unchecked privilege and assumption. She served 18 months in federal prison for filing false reports and interference with flight operations, during which time she became an advocate for criminal justice reform and racial equality education. Upon her release, she dedicated her life to undoing the damage her prejudice had caused, speaking at universities and corporate training programs about the devastating cost of assumptions. Dr. Cameron Brooks never sought publicity for his actions that night, but the changes he catalyzed extended far beyond aviation. The Department of Transportation appointed him to lead a federal task force on equality in transportation industries. His manual hydraulic procedures saved lives in 3 subsequent aviation emergencies. Most importantly, his example inspired a generation of professionals to recognize that competence has no color, expertise has no appearance, and qualification cannot be determined by prejudice. The little girl, Emma, grew up to become an aerospace engineer, crediting that brief conversation with Dr. Brooks as the moment she decided to use her intelligence to help others. Captain Jake Morrison became one of the industry's leading advocates for bias recognition training, speaking at pilot conferences about the night he almost removed the person most qualified to save his passengers' lives, and Flight 847. It became known throughout Vanguard Airlines as the flight that changed everything the night when racism met its match in quiet competence, when prejudice was defeated by professionalism, and when one man's grace under pressure transformed an entire industry. The real legacy wasn't just policy changes or training programs, though those mattered. The real legacy was the understanding that excellence speaks louder than ignorance. Competence commands more respect than entitlement, and dignity in the face of prejudice can move mountains, or in this case can ground racism and launch justice into the sky. Because sometimes the most powerful response to hatred is not anger, but the quiet demonstration that competence needs no permission. Expertise requires no approval, and the right to excel belongs to everyone willing to earn it through skill dedication and the courage to save lives even when those lives belong to people who question your right to exist in their space. Dr. Cameron Brooks proved that night that when excellence meets ignorance, excellence always wins. And when competence meets prejudice, competence doesn't just triumph, it transforms everything around it. That transformation continues every day in every airport on every flight where qualified professionals of all colors and backgrounds do their jobs with the knowledge that their competence is protected, their expertise is valued, and their right to excel is defended by policies born from one night when racism tried to remove safety and failed completely. The story of Flight 847 reminds us that progress isn't just about laws and policies. It's about moments when individuals choose excellence over easy assumptions, competence over comfortable prejudices, and the courage to do what's right, even when what's right isn't what's popular. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power of quiet competence over loud prejudice, then I need you to do something right now. Hit that like button to help this message reach more people who need to hear it. Subscribe to this channel because we're just getting started with stories that matter. And share this video with someone who needs to understand that excellence comes in all colors. Competence has many faces and heroes don't always look like what we expect. Comment below and tell me about a time when you witnessed someone's assumptions proven wrong by someone's competence. Let's build a community where dignity and qualification matter more than appearance and assumption. Next week, I've got another incredible story about a janitor who everyone underestimated until the day the CEO needed him most. You won't want to miss it. Until then, remember, excellence doesn't shout for attention. It just shows up, does the work, and changes the world, one competent action at a time. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.